anybody here? Can you hear me? If you can hear me, not once but yes.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz, and you're listening to a slightly different mini-episode of Not Once for Yes.
Now, please don't worry, this won't affect the main episode. We will be bringing you that very soon. This mini-sode was originally only meant to be a quick news story on the main show. But as I started researching and writing, this place got under my skin. The story demanded that it be told properly. And 11 or so pages later, I realised that we needed to give this one the space it deserved.
So here we are today bringing you a slightly different kind of mini-episode, but we do hope you enjoy it nonetheless. And we hope that you'll understand why it wouldn't have been right to try and cram it into a short news story. And so, without further ado, let's head to the southwest of England and the county of Devon.
We often joke that it would be quite difficult to get lost in the wilderness in England, even for a person like me with zero sense of direction, because it's actually quite hard to find places in this densely populated land where you couldn't safely bumble your way back to some kind of civilization within half a day's walk, whether by accident or design. But one exception to this is Dartmoor, one of the few remaining wild places of England. An upland landscape of heather moorland, Dartmoor is fairly notorious on a few fronts, not least of which is how difficult it can be to navigate. From its high ridges, the views across 368 square miles of the national park are epic. Uninterrupted by signs of modern life, the bleak landscape is punctuated with startling yellow dots of stubborn gorse bushes and massive granite boulders erupting at the tops of hills like ancient craggy edifices of a wild and mysterious land. These rocky outcrops towering solemnly over the moorland are known as tors, and the jumble of smaller granite boulders that litter the steep hillsides below them are known by Devon natives as clitter and by natives of nearby Cornwall as clutter. But below these peaks, the ground is riddled with peat bogs, and unsuspecting walkers can easily find themselves stranded in spongy, saturated ground that gives way suddenly underfoot, or find themselves cut off by the number of rivers and streams that creep through and feed from this damp landscape. Navigation can be difficult. Aside from the tors themselves, the main landmarks to orient oneself are prehistoric monuments, burial mounds, and settlement remains left behind by an ancient people. Subtle signs, largely reclaimed by nature as they are slowly swallowed back up by the peaty moors. And then there's the weather. There's an old joke that if you don't like the weather on Dartmoor, just wait 10 minutes. And it may be a joke, but it's true enough and it can be deadly. Hikers starting out a walk on a calm, sunny day are often caught out unprepared when the weather turns in a matter of seconds to sleet and hail, howling winds, and perhaps the most disconcerting of all, thick, impenetrable fog that descends in the blink of an eye to choke the landscape, reducing visibility to mere feet and making navigation treacherous. Maybe all this is why Dartmoor is also home to one of Britain's most infamous prisons, known historically for having housed some of the UK's most dangerous criminals. The high security measures can only have been reinforced by the inhospitable terrain that lay beyond. And it's probably also why it's still used by the British Army for training today, adding another element of peril to its reputation. Firing ranges are spread out across the moors, and hikers must keep a wary eye out for red flags, indicating when live firing is taking place, as well as watching out for stray, unexploded ordnance underfoot, left over from a time long past when safety regulations weren't quite what they are today. This unforgiving landscape has, of course, made for fertile ground in which folk tales, myths, and legends could flourish. Dartmoor is a place swathed in legends as thick as the impenetrable mists that descend to smother the moors. And yet, despite this rather foreboding reputation, Dartmoor occupies a precious place in so many hearts. Exactly because it is so wild, so untamed, and instilled in the bones of many of us is a deep, deep longing for these untouched places. Places in which we can truly immerse ourselves in nature, as unbridled and unapologetic as we can find it. Fortunately, this landscape has largely been preserved by its designation as a national park since 1951, and has the distinction of being one of the few places in the country where the public have the right to roam fairly freely. Although we have a fantastic network of long-distance footpaths in England, these paths largely pass through privately owned land, and any straying from these set routes is classed as trespassing. But the Dartmoor Commons Act of 1985 legally secured public access to the Dartmoor Common Land for recreation on foot or by horseback. No vehicular access across the commons are allowed, so anyone wanting to access them must do so either on their own 2 feet or those of a trusty 4-legged companion. In addition to this, the wording of the Dartmoor Commons Act, specifically the clause that states, "The public shall have a right of access to the commons on foot and on horseback for the purpose of open-air recreation," has for many years been interpreted to include camping, at least the sort largely referred to in the UK as wild camping. And the Dartmoor National Park Association has long supported this, providing that campers pack everything in and out on foot, no large tents or large groups, no staying for more than a couple of nights, no fires, and always leave no trace of where you have been. It meant that Dartmoor was the only place in which it was legal to wild camp in England. Everywhere else, it's a civil offence unless in a designated paid campsite or on private land with explicit permission from the landowner. And for those feeling the call to wild places reverberating in their very bones, this made Dartmoor a very precious place indeed. But in January of this year, all that was shattered, and thousands of people across England, with the love of Dartmoor beating hard in their hearts, turned to the ancient spirits of the land for help.
You see, although the public has the right of access to the Dartmoor Commons, the land itself is still privately owned. In medieval times, the land was a royal hunting forest owned by the Crown, and some of it is still owned today by the Duchy of Cornwall. But over the centuries, large tracts of the moors have found their way into the hands of many different private owners. Because of the national park status and the Dartmoor Commons Act, these owners are obliged to allow the public access to their land in permitted areas and under certain conditions. But one owner, millionaire hedge fund manager Alexander Darwall, has been pushing back against these public access rights. According to locals, he's been trying to find ways to block access on his land ever since he purchased 4,000 acres of the national park in 2011, on which he offers pheasant shoots, deer stalking and holiday rentals to wealthy customers. He'd already caused rumblings of dissent locally by trying to ban horse riders on his property, and then, Late last year, he took the park authority to the High Court, arguing that the clause in the Dartmoor Commons Act stating that the public should have access for reasons of recreation was never intended to include camping. Shockingly, despite the long tradition of leave no trace wild camping on Dartmoor, and the support of the park authority in favour of wild campers, Dartmoor actually won the case. The judge ruled that there was no implication in the clause that it included camping, and bizarrely, claimed that there was no historical tradition of permitted camping on the moor. The result of this meant, in practical terms, that wild camping everywhere in England was banned with immediate effect. As you might expect, the outpouring of emotion was tremendous at the loss of this previously held public right, at the loss of any lawful way to sleep under the stars in the dark sky of a wild landscape, not to mention the implications for how easily what had previously been believed to be a sacrosanct right of the public had been snatched away, and how this might pave the way for future losses of access. A tide of resistance rose, protests were mustered, a mass march across Dartmoor was organised, echoing the rebellious spirit of the historic Kinder Scout mass trespass of the 1930s. And it would have been easy for the focus of these protests to turn to hate, and for the march to be one made in anger. But instead, protesters drew upon their love of Dartmoor, tapped down into the beautiful mystery and folklore of their beloved landscape, and made the focus of their protest a call to raise the ancient land spirit and protector of Dartmoor, Old Crockern.
The spirit of Old Crockern wears more than one face. In one aspect, he's the towering boulders of the granite tors, craggy-faced with eyes the colour of peat pools. In another, he rides a skeletal steed, leading the wild hunt across the moors from the spooky and haunted Wistman's Wood on stormy nights. Wistman's Wood, almost bang in the middle of Dartmoor National Park, is a legendary place in its own right. It is one of the last few remaining examples of ancient upland woodland in England, and it's one of the oldest. When hunter-gatherers still roamed Dartmoor, it's thought that the desolate moors we see today would have instead been forested, with pollen evidence in the archaeological record for willow, birch, oak, elm and hazel trees. Today, this scrap of just over 8.5 acres of oak woodland is all that survives. But it has a reputation much, much bigger than its diminutive size. Locals apparently refuse to go anywhere near it after dusk. Everyone who visits, even people with no interest whatsoever in the strange or folkloric, remark upon its uncanny air. And unsurprisingly, stories have abounded through the centuries about its use as a sacred druidic site, a suspicion only encouraged by some attributing the name of Wistman's Woods to the Saxon word Wistman, meaning wise man. The woods look like a cursed forest straight out of a fairy tale, or the entrance to some underworld realm of the Fae. The oak trees are stunted, their limbs twisted and contorted, bent low and trailing gnarled limbs over the boulder-strewn forest floor, creating eerie tunnels of warped and seemingly writhing branches, festooned with hanging beards of lichen, draped like garlands from arthritic limbs. And everywhere a velvet green carpet of moss, coating the densely packed granite clitter floor, cloaking the oaks themselves in a verdant fur, and lending the shady woodland an otherworldly, emerald green half-light. The edge of the woods is skirted by a lichway, also known as a corpse road or coffin road.
Back in the days when hamlets, huts, and farmsteads were scattered across the moors, residents would have had a long journey to reach their local church, traipsing up to 12 miles to nearby Lidford along a well-established ancient trackway. This, of course, would include their very last journey to the church, or indeed to anywhere, when they would be carried to their final resting place in the church's graveyard. Many routes such as this existed across the more sparsely inhabited places in Britain, and it's safe to say that most of these coffin roads come with their own ghostly legends. The Dartmoor Lichway is no exception, and locals and visiting hikers alike have apparently reported seeing a procession of phantom monks in white robes slowly traversing the corpse road as it passes by Wistman's Wood. Under the crooked oaks, nests of adders, the UK's only venomous snake, are said to hide, slithering along the boulder-strewn ground, and legend warns that these adders are the most deadly in the whole of Dartmoor. One apparition of the woods, that of a little dog named Jumbo, whose restless shade can be seen running amongst the rocks chasing rabbits, is said to have been the victim of one such venomous adder's bite. But the most famous supernatural resident of Wistman's Woods is a pack of massive black dogs with glaring red eyes and huge yellow fangs, sometimes said to be glowing, sometimes said to be breathing fire, and presided over by a terrifying dark figure riding a skeletal horse. This ghastly hunt is said to tear out of Wistman's Woods on dark, stormy nights and ride for Crockern Tor, a large rock outcrop not far to the south, and is undoubtedly one reason that locals avoid the woods after dark, for it's said that the cadaverous huntsman rides abroad to collect stray souls, and any unfortunate witnesses to the frightful pack can expect to be transported to another realm, or encounter certain misfortune in their near future. This unearthly pack of black dogs is known as the Wisthounds, or Yeth Hounds, but if you're thinking that they bear more than a passing resemblance to the Black Shuck, you'd be right. There seems to be a fair number of stories from around Dartmoor involving spectral hounds, and it's argued that these legends of the Dartmoor landscape inspired Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to write The Hound of the Baskervilles. You would also be correct if you thought this story sounded a lot like the wild hunt tales from Northern European folklore, with many suspecting that this spectral pack of hounds would have originally been led by Norse god Odin on his 8-legged steed Sleipnir, racing across stormy skies in a cacophony of baying hounds, screaming winds, and thundering hooves. Whether that's the case or not, these days the race towards Crockern Tor has now inextricably linked this tale with the ancient Dartmoor land spirit.
I don't know which came first, Old Crockern the spirit or Crockern Tor the landmark, and I couldn't find any information to say which was named after what. Crockern Tor is a granite outcrop close to where the two roads passing through the national park cross, and this great rock formation is famous for having once been the meeting place for the Stannery Parliament. For hundreds of years, mining was big industry in Devon and Cornwall. Yep, just like in Poldark. But in the case of Dartmoor, it was tin mining, not copper. The first written record of tin extraction in Devon dates to the 12th century and only ended on an industrial scale in the 1930s. In fact, the industry of mining became so important to the economy of Britain during those 700-odd years that it developed its own parliament and laws, called stannary laws, which, in long-held tradition, actually took precedent over English common law. The crossroads near Crockern Tor provided a central point where representatives from the 4 principal stannary towns of Devon could meet, and the granite formations themselves provided an imposing amphitheatre in which to stage their deliberations. The largest rock formation is known as Parliament Rock or Parliament Seat, and the stacked granite does indeed appear to form something akin to a grand high-backed seat from which one would have had quite the commanding presence. According to antiquarians of the 17th and 19th centuries, below this formation there was once a granite-hewn table and chairs that formed a lower court. It must have been quite a sight to see this Parliament convene in their Moorstone Theatre in the middle of the opened windswept Dartmoor landscape. I wonder how on earth they took notes when it started chucking it down with rain or when the infamous mists descended. Looking at the towers of blocky granite, one might indeed see a high seat of Parliament. But some also say that another glance at the Tor might just afford you a glimpse of the outline of Old Crockern's face. For his face is that of the wild, craggy landscape itself. Author S. Baring Gould, in their 1899 work, A Book of the West, Volume 1, Devon, relates the legend through the words of a local, who describes Old Crockern as a girt old spirit of the moors, girt meaning great or large, grey as granite, and his eyebrows hanging down over his glimmering eyes like sedge, and his eyes deep as peatwater pools. The tale is a cautionary one. Cautionary, that is, for any outsiders thinking they could take the land away from its people using power or money, which sounds pretty relevant to our modern-day cause, right?
The story goes that many years ago, presumably meaning years before this tale was committed to paper in the 19th century, a rich man from Manchester named Fowler came down to Dartmoor and bought up acres of moorland. He was used to city ways and thought that nature was his adversary, something to be conquered, not worked with. And he had the conceit to think that being wealthy meant he could bend the land to his every will and want. He enclosed thousands of acres, excluding the locals from their beloved moors. He brought down machinery to drain the peat bogs and churn up the heather to make arable land that he would use up until it was spent and barren. One day, the would-be farmer happened across an old moorman, as weathered as the Tors themselves, and birthed from this feral landscape. The old soul greeted the farmer politely, but quickly went on to say that he'd had a dream last night about the city man. The farmer laughed at such flattery, but the local held up a warning hand to halt the farmer's good humour, for it was a message of caution. In the old moorman's dream, Old Crockern himself, with his dark peaty eyes and craggy granite face, asked if he knew the city man with the big ideas. Having confirmed this was the case, the ancient land spirit asked for a message to be conveyed to Fowler. The message was short, but uncompromising. You tell Mr. Fowler that if he so much as scratches my back, I'll tear out his pockets. Of course, the farmer was far too arrogant to heed this warning, and laughed it off as nothing but superstition. But sure enough, as he tried with all his newfangled equipment to drain the peat bogs, Old Crockern drained his purse. As he set his fancy tools to scratch up the land, Old Crockern tore out his pockets. All the farmer's efforts failed. He could not tame this land. Trying to take it from its people had left him in financial ruin and his reputation in tatters. Left to live out his old age a bitter pauper, you can be sure he regretted the day he did not heed the warning of Old Crockern.
So you can see why thousands of people across England turned to the ancient land protector in a time of distress at the threat of their beloved moors being snatched from their hands once again. Only this time, it's not just the people of Dartmoor looking to Old Crockern to preserve justice. It's people from all over England and beyond. 3,000 of them, in fact, gathered at the village of Cornwood on Saturday the 21st of January 2023 to march in peaceful protest on the Darwall's Dartmoor estate. There was singing, dancing and drumming across the moors, words of celebration and appreciation for the land, and hopes not only to regain access, but also for this campaign to pave the way to fight for the right to roam all across England and for the message to spread far and wide. I want to share with you some parts of a speech made by a man named Martin Shaw during the march, who, in his own words, arrived on Dartmoor many years ago in a tent and found it so lovely that he stayed. I found his words quite moving and felt they embodied the heartfelt passion with which everybody there was fighting for Dartmoor. Crockern, if you know him, is irascible in nature. Like all the old gods, he has all the weather patterns in him. Sometimes he's Crockern Tor, but he has a younger aspect too when he rides out on his horse of bones, and you don't want to get in the way of him, that's for sure. We are Crockern. Take that deep into you. Let the beauty that is here radiate out. Because the kind of activism that we're involved with is all about delight. It's about delight. It's about wonder. It's about goodness. It's about all the things that Dartmoor always does to us. We come up here in a transactional frame of mind, and we leave in a transformational one. Now grow quiet. Go into yourself. Call on whoever you feel needs to be here, and let's see if over the next few minutes something arrives. And wonderfully, to the surprise of many, and presumably thanks to some genius designers and puppeteers, a stunning, at least 8-foot tall model of Old Crockern did indeed rise up from the landscape. His craggy face as grey and angular as weathered granite, his eyes lashed with sedge, as deep as peat pools, and his body cloaked in the verdant green of the rare mosses of Wistman's woods, and streaming with ribbons, echoing both the beardy lichens of the ancient woodland and the cluties found tied around the ancient sacred sites of Britain. Accompanied by a human entourage of similarly beribboned dancers and musicians, the appearance of Old Crockern himself infused proceedings with an atmosphere of joy and wonder.
So, will Old Crockern prevail? Well, since the protest, some access for wild camping has been scraped back into the public domain, through some landowners volunteering their permission to allow camping. But this has still left large amounts of Dartmoor off limits to campers, and the agreement is fragile, uncertain, can be revoked by any landowner at any time, and requires the park authority to pay the landowners hundreds of pounds in a yearly agreement for something that was free just a few months ago. But of course, no one is giving up that easily, not with the spirit of Old Crockern rising in their bones. In early April, Dartmoor National Park won the right to appeal against the judge's ruling that camping had never been permitted on Dartmoor, so the first battle is won, although there are many more to come as they build their case and raise the necessary funds to take the fight to court and try to win back Dartmoor. So if the folk tales and ghost stories from this rugged landscape stir something deep in your bones, maybe think on Old Crockern a while. Maybe tell his story and help keep it alive. And of course, there are also other very practical ways to help if you want to. The first, and a very important one, is that if you decide to visit Dartmoor, please leave no trace. Unfortunately, a very few disrespectful visitors have in recent years caused problems in some areas with litter and waste. Not just in Dartmoor, but in many beauty spots around the country, which sadly has lent ammunition to attempts to restrict access in national parks and in other areas. So, anything you take in with you, please take back out again. Remember the mantra, leave only footprints, take only memories. This especially applies in Wistman's Woods. As you might expect, it's a designated protected site and an area of special scientific interest due to the very rare and fragile mosses and lichens that grow there, so please don't disturb these amazing plants.
Of course, we don't think for a second that anyone listening to this would be anything other than incredibly respectful to every place they visit. But it always bears saying, if only to normalise and promote more widely the concept of leave no trace. And if you really want to help Old Crockern, we'll leave links to where you can donate to Dartmoor National Park's fundraising page and help them raise the legal fees they need to fight this. You can also find out more about the campaign through web pages and social media of righttoroam.org and The Stars Are Ours on Instagram. And as always, there will be plenty of links in the citations and resources for you to check out if you want to learn more about mystical, mysterious Dartmoor and see pictures of the incredible Old Crockern costume. We haven't even got close to covering all the myths, legends and ghost stories of Dartmoor today, so it's a place we'll be coming back to for sure. I know this has been a little bit of a different mini episode today. As I said, this story was only meant to feature as a brief paragraph in our news slot. But Dartmoor got its hooks in me. It pulled me in and wouldn't let me go. One paragraph quickly turned into 10 pages and more, and I became too invested to give up on it or try and make it fit into a tiny slot. As you can probably tell, this case, the right to roam and access to our wild landscapes, is a matter very close to our hearts. And although we've not yet had the opportunity to wild camp on Dartmoor, it's something I know I dearly want to do one day. I've found this whole matter with the court case quite upsetting, not just from the camping perspective, but the potential ramification of future similar cases. Many of the places we visit for the show are freely and publicly accessible. We do visit places that have tickets and charges and fees, but we also love to rootle out the places that are not. Some of our favourites are the unheard of ones that are tucked away down a quiet footpath. And many of these haunted places happen to be freely accessible because well-established public access paths happen right by and even through them. And once these access rights start being eroded, I fear for the potential future loss of many more of these amazing places, or the monetisation of them. which for many will mean that they're unable to access them anymore, especially in the current economic climate. So please, keep visiting them, keep using those footpaths, keep loving and walking them respectfully, leaving no trace but taking forward the stories and legends and folklore to preserve for ours and for future generations. They're important, and I hope that we can always access them.
We hope you enjoyed this slightly different mini-episode, and that you'll join us for the next main episode of Knock Once for Yes.
If you please